Diana Thompson was 60 when she was ushered into a glass-fronted room with a too-clean table and an envelope with her name printed in generic font, the kind of place where final agreements are signed without raising a voice. She'd spent 30 years managing other people's agendas, budgets, and crises, and that two-paragraph note with formal acknowledgements sent her back to the street with a box and a silence that rattled her ribs. A few weeks earlier, she'd signed the divorce, a procedure, without flowers or a fight, barely a stamp, and the feeling that time could dismantle a house without knocking down a single wall. In her circle, no one said, "You've aged," but the message floated around. It was the stage of becoming small, of speaking softly, of not inconveniencing others with late-blooming ambitions. The sisters sent audio recordings with recipes and jokes about the golden years, and Rachel, her daughter, preferred to change the subject when work came up in conversation. The Hebe apartment, organized with office discipline, seemed to ignore her. Plants that needed water, folders with neat labels, a magnet on the refrigerator with the phrase, "Today also counts." That afternoon, Diana placed the box on the floor, stood longer than expected, and breathed like someone tightening their seatbelt before a rollover. She didn't cry. She took out a cardboard-covered notebook, wrote the date, and a dry line. "Do not accept invisibility." The sound of the city remained the same, but something in her head shifted, as if an old gear had decided to bite again. That same night, the living room became a classroom. A white lamp, reheated coffee, and a graph paper notebook waiting for a strategy that didn't exist in the human resources manuals. Diana downloaded old reports, compared balance sheets like one superimposes X-rays, and underlined with an amber marker every opportunity that survived 3 questions. Why are you selling? What's stifling your margin? Where's the leak? She learned to read footnotes as if they were confessions, and to distinguish between structural loss and mess that can be cleaned up with time and method. She noted suppliers, cash cycles, penalty clauses, and drew clumsy arrows linking departments as if weaving the backbone of a company together again. The name appeared at 2:17, when fatigue weakened her embarrassment. DT Enterprises. 2 letters that stood for last name and promise, and a word that forced her to think big even when no one was looking. On a separate sheet of paper, he wrote an operating principle. Don't compete for brilliance. Buy what others underestimate. Organize, integrate, breathe. He closed the notebook, rested his forehead against the cold window, and counted 3 buses passing by, not to measure his insomnia, but to reassure himself that the world was still moving. When he returned to his desk, he underlined in black ink, "Experience is not junk." And that phrase, more than a harangue, worked like a new screw on a worn hinge. At first, DT Enterprises was nothing more than a blue folder with scattered papers and a computer file with graphs that looked like leaning towers about to collapse. Diana worked in silence, because every time she tried to talk about the subject, she received scathing comments. Her older sister called it a fun hobby. Rachel insisted she travel, that she enjoy retirement like normal mothers. The condescending stare of others was a constant reminder that she was walking, alone, without applause or support. But that solitude became fuel. She got up early to read reports, ate lunch in front of spreadsheets, and jotted down questions that seemed absurd, but brought her closer to the heart of each business. She realized that her goal wasn't to compete with young people hungry for tech incubators, but to identify invisible companies, those that the market abandoned like old furniture on the sidewalk. While everyone thought she was knitting to pass the time, she was actually weaving a strategic map with the precision of a seamstress, measuring down to the last thread. And although the outside world couldn't see it, within her department, a company was beginning to grow that was both a manifesto and a lifeline. The first opportunity arose in a forgotten industrial park where the walls were stained with damp and the gates rusted like closed mouths. It was a technical supplies company on the verge of bankruptcy, with suffocating debts and an owner tired of rowing in murky waters. Diana arrived with a notebook under her arm and a calmness that disconcerted the employees, accustomed to hearing only promises from bankers in a hurry. She negotiated without raising her voice, asking with surgical patience about suppliers, deadlines, and the margins hidden in petty cash. When she signed the contract with a pen bought on sale, she felt she was acquiring not only a company in ruins, but a tangible piece of the future. No one celebrated with her, except for the cup of instant coffee she lifted in the kitchen that night, looking out the window at the city lights. There was no champagne or toasts, but there was a certainty that made her skin tense. She could still rescue what others had given up for dead. That night, he wrote in capital letters in his notebook, "First Victory," and allowed himself to smile silently, aware that no one else understood the magnitude of the moment. From that first acquisition onward, her routine changed as if she'd crossed an invisible door. Her days were filled with meetings in vanilla-scented coffee shops, urgent calls answered on the sidewalk in the rain, and folders traveling with her in taxis stuck in traffic. Every document read was a piece of ground conquered, every miscalculation a lesson angrily jotted down in the margins of a notebook. Rumors began to circulate in corporate corridors. Someone, with surgical discretion, was buying up small companies that seemed hopeless and restoring them to profitability. That someone was D. Thompson, a name that was beginning to be repeated with respect, though no one could put a face to it. Meanwhile, in her family, Diana continued to be the mother who supposedly wasted her time. This double life strengthened her. Invisibility at home became strategic freedom in the market. Every night, as she closed her laptop, she thought, "Let them underestimate me. They don't know how good that disguise is for me." In 2 years, DT Enterprises had consolidated itself into a surprising portfolio, 6 companies under her control, and a valuation approaching $50 million. What was a case study for the trade press remained for Rachel a small business she preferred not to talk about. With the wedding approaching, her daughter asked her for a favor that hurt like a knife, that she not mention anything about the company in front of Jake's colleagues. Rachel feared that her mother would become a source of ridicule, that her midlife crisis would tarnish the polished image of the event. Diana agreed to remain silent, although every swallowed word lodged like a stone in her throat. She tried on a sober dress, chose discreet shoes, and practiced the art of smiling without saying too much. She knew that tonight wasn't about her, but about Rachel, although deep down she sensed that the silence imposed on her would soon reach its limit. The wedding day dawned with a clear sun, the kind that makes buildings shine like mirrors and forces you to squint. The chosen hall was a display of perfection, crystal chandeliers cascading like icy waterfalls, tables covered with ivory tablecloths, and white flower centerpieces that perfumed the air with an almost suffocating fragrance. The waiters moved with military precision, and a string quartet practiced soft pieces in a corner. Diana arrived punctually, wrapped in a dress with simple lines and a pulled-back hairstyle that accentuated the firmness of her face. She sat discreetly, politely greeting the guests who barely glanced at her, as if she were just another decoration at the event. Inside, she maintained a feigned calm, the kind of serenity one adopts when one knows the battlefield will not be physical, but emotional. She watched her daughter walk among the attendants with a twinkle in her eyes, wondering how they had reached that distance, where the success of one seemed to embarrass the other. The ceremony went off without a hitch, amid rehearsed vows and measured applause, but the real test awaited at the reception. The lights dimmed slightly, and glasses clinked with the first toast as a smiling Rachel took the microphone accompanied by her godmother. What began as an emotional speech soon became tinged with irony. Jokes about her mother's midlife crisis, sarcastic comments about her small business, and laughter that erupted from table to table. "Imagine my mother playing entrepreneur at 60, Rachel said, eliciting peals of laughter that bounced off the walls like slaps. Diana held her glass firmly, feeling the wine turn bitter in her mouth, while each laugh pierced her skin like invisible thorns. The inner silence that enveloped her was so dense that she barely heard the background music. It was the price of having agreed to remain silent, the cost of letting others tell her story in her place. Among the tables, one man didn't laugh. Robert Anderson, a renowned tech executive and Jake's direct boss, watched the scene with an uncomfortable seriousness. He knew the name D. Thompson well. He'd seen it on contracts, on balance sheets for acquisitions that had reshaped the market in recent months. Until that moment, he had never imagined that this mysterious figure, both respected and feared, could be sitting a few feet away, silently enduring the mockery of his own family. While the others continued to laugh, he put the pieces together in his head like a puzzle that suddenly made sense. The woman they'd just ridiculed was the same one who had closed deals with surgical composure and strategic vision. A flush of indignation ran through his chest. How could they mock someone who held so much power in her hands? The discomfort drove him to action, and with a calm gesture, he asked for the microphone, interrupting the laughter with an expectant murmur that spread throughout the room. The room hung in a tense calm as Robert took the floor. In a firm voice, he introduced Diana not as the mother of the bride, but as the owner of 6 companies, several of them directly tied to the career prospects of many in the audience. He revealed that the woman sitting discreetly at the side table was actually D. Thompson, one of the most influential investors in the industry, responsible for rescuing companies that others had given up for dead. The silence that followed was absolute, as if someone had pulled down an invisible curtain. Smiles froze on faces, glasses were left half raised, and even the string quartet seemed to miss a note. In a matter of seconds, the ridiculed figure was transformed into the epicenter of respect and awe. Diana didn't move, didn't raise her voice, or correct anyone. She let the truth speak for itself. Rachel froze, her face distorted and her lips parted, as if someone had sucked the air out of the room. The very woman she had publicly humiliated turned out to be the linchpin of the corporate ladder her husband aspired to climb. A murmur of disbelief spread among the guests. Some looked at each other uncomfortably, others pretended to sip from their glasses, and a few lowered their heads in embarrassment for having laughed seconds earlier. The bride felt her cheeks burning beneath her makeup, an unbearable heat that she couldn't hide with even the most forced smile. The dress, so carefully chosen, began to weigh on her like uncomfortable armor, and her ears only echoed with the word Anderson had solemnly repeated: owner. The brilliance of her dream night had become a scene of irreparable shame. Jake, on the other hand, was the first to compose himself, albeit awkwardly. The condescending tone he usually used to address his mother-in-law suddenly disappeared, replaced by a mask of hasty respect. He stood up from the table, walked toward Diana, and tried to show deference, aware that this revelation could affect his own career prospects. The guests began to approach with tense smiles and improvised phrases that attempted to mask their bewilderment. "An honor to meet you, Mrs. Thompson. How admirable your career." The air in the room became heavy, charged with nervousness and a forced respect that contrasted starkly with the laughter of minutes before. Diana remained motionless, glass in hand, watching as the center of gravity of the party shifted toward her without her needing to utter a single word. In the days that followed, the echoes of that scene continued to resonate in every family conversation. Rachel avoided calling her mother, unable to face the mirror of her own humiliation. What had been intended as a moment of mockery turned into a public wound that was difficult to heal. In therapy, she heard for the first time what she had never wanted to admit. It wasn't Diana's undertaking that embarrassed her, but her own insecurity about not being worthy of a mother who at 60 had achieved what many young people only dreamed of. That revelation left her exposed, forced to confront a deep resentment she had disguised with irony and silence. The distance between them became a wall of silence that not even the newly celebrated celebration of their marriage could hide. Diana's sister, on the other hand, transformed the scathing criticism into sudden pride. She began bragging at social gatherings about having a millionaire sister, conveniently forgetting the years when she had called her deluded. Jake, for his part, adopted an excessively formal, almost servile attitude toward his mother-in-law, fearful of losing any job, opportunities her name might guarantee. But Diana watched silently, aware that much of that respect was a self-serving mask. She no longer sought validation from them. She had learned that true recognition depended not on blood or social ties, but on facts that no one could deny. And in that certainty, for the first time in years, she found a peace that wasn't shaken by the opinions of others. With her family's respect becoming an ambiguous spectacle, Diana decided to focus her energy on the only thing that gave her real meaning, her company. Her mornings were filled with meetings in glass-enclosed rooms where young executives listened to her with a mixture of nerves and admiration. Her afternoons were spent reviewing contracts that felt like labyrinths, and her nights were once again the setting for strategies drawn in notebooks filled with arrows. The difference now was that all that effort no longer stemmed from the need to prove something to others, but from the inner satisfaction of knowing she was capable. She had regained control of her time, her voice, and her destiny, and that power tasted sweeter than any revenge. Even so, deep inside, she recognized the wound, the pain of her own daughter not being able to applaud that from the beginning. It was in this context that she decided to open a new space in her schedule, far from contracts and balance sheets. She began welcoming older women who had been dismissed from their jobs or displaced after a divorce. She invited them to a simple room in her office, with white walls and a large window that let in the afternoon light. There, without heroic speeches or magic formulas, she bluntly shared her experience, the rejections, the sleepless nights, the debts that nearly bankrupted her, and the small triumphs that kept her alive. She didn't charge anything. She did it because she had discovered that sharing her story was another way of investing, not in businesses, but in the dignity of others. In the bright eyes of these women, she saw reflected what mattered most to her, the certainty that it was never too late to reclaim the right to be visible. Time finally gave Diana the perspective she'd previously lacked. She was no longer the woman dismissed with an impersonal letter or the wife abandoned in a courtroom without witnesses. She was the architect of a second life. Her former colleagues, who had once dismissed her with condescending pats on the back, now sought her out for advice or even partnership. Diana greeted them courteously, but without forgetting the indifference with which they had once celebrated her departure. The belated respect no longer dazzled her. She accepted it as a logical consequence, not a gift. She had learned that her value depended not on the selective memory of others, but on the solidity of what she had built when no one was betting on her name. That clarity made her freer than any number on the balance sheet. Her relationship with Rachel, on the other hand, remained fragile. They shared brief encounters, meals filled with thick silences, veiled apologies, and glances that eluded the essential. For Diana, the wound lay not in the mockery of that night, but in her daughter's inability to see her with pride before the world did. However, she wasn't seeking revenge or theatrical reconciliations. She simply established a non-negotiable boundary. She would no longer accept being treated like a shadow. If Rachel wanted to get closer, she would have to do so from a place of honesty, not shame or convenience. That boundary was her way of saying, "I love you, but not at the price of becoming invisible again." The growth of DT Enterprises continued like a silent tide that no one could stop. Newspapers began to mention her name with respect, specialized forums analyzed her actions, and even competitors observed her with a mixture of fear and admiration. But what surprised Diana most was that external recognition was no longer essential. The true victory lay in having regained control of her time, in choosing which meetings to attend, which projects to accept, and which people to open the door to in her life. The woman who for decades had obeyed other people's agendas now wrote her own in firm ink, and each decision bore the mark of her autonomy. This new rhythm restored her to the serenity of someone who no longer competes for validation, but rather walks out of conviction. At the same time, her encounters with other women multiplied. Some arrived trembling, burdened by years of disdain from work or family. Others were just looking for a word to confirm they weren't alone. Diana greeted them unhurriedly, offering coffee and a seat by the window where the soft afternoon light streamed in. She spoke to them without embellishment, describing not only her achievements, but also the sleepless nights, the doubts that almost made her give up, and the tears she held back when she faced balance sheets that didn't add up. This gesture of transparency generated an immediate connection. She wasn't a guru, she was a survivor who had found a way to rebuild herself. And in every face that lit up as they listened to her, she recognized the clearest proof that her experience had a value that went far beyond money. As the months passed, Diana began to notice a subtle but profound change in herself. She no longer reacted angrily to condescending comments because she no longer needed them as a mirror. The signed contracts, the rescued companies, and the women who found inspiration in her story were proof enough that her place in the world was secure. When she walked through the city, she didn't do so with the same haste as before, nor with the downcast gaze of someone afraid of being judged. She walked upright, enjoying the small details, the smell of freshly baked bread on the corner, the murmur of passers-by, the street music that filtered between the cars. This everyday normality was, for her, a luxury that had previously seemed unattainable. The luxury of living without burdening invisibility, like a curse. Within the family, the tension continued to simmer, but it no longer defined her. Rachel began to approach with uncertain steps, sometimes with timid questions about her company, other times with silences that seemed to wordlessly apologize. Diana accepted these attempts without resentment, but also without forgetting. She had learned to set boundaries she'd never dared to set before. Family meals were no longer arenas for discussion, but spaces where she chose how much to share. The difference was that now she did so from a place of freedom, not from a need for validation. And that difference, invisible to many, represented the most important achievement of all, the inner peace of knowing she no longer had anything to prove. External recognition inevitably came. Financial magazines published articles about the mysterious Dee Thompson. Business forums cited her as an example of reinvention, and some of her former colleagues mentioned her with a belated respect that bordered on hypocrisy. Diana accepted interviews, but always with a sober tone, avoiding embellishing her story like a fairy tale. She knew that hers hadn't been a stroke of luck, but rather an accumulation of sleepless nights, processed defeats, and small victories strung together. And although the spotlight insisted on focusing on her, she kept her feet firmly planted in reality. What she valued most wasn't fame, but the autonomy she had gained. That clarity protected her from repeating the mistakes of the past when she lived trapped in the need for external recognition. However, there was one moment that definitively sealed her new identity. One ordinary morning, as she walked down the same street where she had left 2 years earlier, carrying a box in her arms after her dismissal, she stopped in front of the building. She remembered the lump in her throat, the unshed tears, and the certainty of being discarded like an old piece of furniture. Now, however, she saw herself reflected in the glass doors with a different gleam in her eyes and the upright posture of someone who no longer asks permission to exist. She didn't need to enter or prove anything. The victory lay in acknowledging that she had survived that fall and had built a future of her own. She smiled silently, aware that that place no longer held power over her. Family gatherings were never the same after that. Wedding. No one called her a late bloomer or laughed at her plans, although many of those smiles seemed more fear than admiration. Diana noticed but didn't wear herself out, correcting or complaining. She simply observed calmly, aware that the respect she now received was a belated reflection of her efforts. Rachel, little by little, began to show a more genuine interest, asking for details about her plans and listening with an attentiveness she had previously denied her. Even so, Diana maintained the right distance. She had learned that love also needed limits and that she wasn't willing to be reduced to invisibility again. That balance, fragile but firm, was the way she chose to reconcile with her daughter without losing what had cost her so much to win. At the same time, the company continued to grow with the same discretion with which it had been born. Each acquisition was added like a piece of a puzzle that only she seemed to understand in all its magnitude. The young executives who had previously underestimated her now listened to her with reverential respect, taking notes on every word she spoke. Diana smiled because deep down she knew there were no magic formulas, only discipline, patience, and the determination not to give up when everything seemed to invite it. In those moments of clarity, she understood that her greatest triumph lay not in the millions accumulated or in the articles praising her, but in the dignity she had regained. A dignity she had earned in silence and that now shone with a force impossible to extinguish. At 62, Diana had achieved a calm she never imagined possible. She was no longer burdened by the urgency of justifying every step she took or the anxiety of pleasing everyone. Her life was now a set of conscious decisions, choosing who to work with, what causes to dedicate resources to, and who to spend her time with. Sleepless nights had transformed into peaceful early mornings, accompanied by tea and the serene satisfaction of having fulfilled her duty. Sometimes she remembered the cruel laughter of that wedding and felt it distant, like an echo that no longer held power over her present. That memory, instead of hurting, served as a reminder of how far she had come and how much she had changed. Her social respect continued to grow, but for her, the essential aspect lay elsewhere. What truly fulfilled her was seeing the women who attended her talks raise their heads with more confidence after listening to her. In those encounters, she found a reflection of her own struggle, and each testimony became living proof that her story had meaning beyond the numbers. Diana knew that money could disappear, that companies could be sold or go bankrupt, but what no one would take away from her was the strength she had cultivated during the darkest moment of her life. That certainty accompanied her every step, like an internal compass that was impossible to break. And on that compass was written the principle that now guided everything she did. Never underestimate a woman who has decided to no longer be underestimated. The end of her journey didn't come with a bang, but with a powerful serenity. One afternoon, from the terrace of her office. She looked out at the illuminated city and realized she had achieved it, not only building a company valued in the millions, but above all, regaining control of her own narrative. She was no longer the laid-off woman with a box in her arms or the humiliated mother in a crowded room. She was the architect of her second life, living proof that reinvention has no expiration date. That thought brought a calm smile to her face, one that didn't seek witnesses or applause. The smile of someone who knows that true triumph isn't measured in signed contracts, but in the freedom to never again ask permission to exist. And so, at 62, Diana Thompson closed her story with a luminous certainty. She would never again be invisible. She confirmed this by walking back down the same street where, 2 years earlier, she had wept after being fired. This time, she crossed it with her head held high, her step firm, and the conviction that no external judgment could diminish her again. She didn't need revenge or explanations. She had found something more valuable than all of that. She had found dignity, freedom, and inner peace. And that peace, won with effort and tears, was the legacy that no one could ever take away from her.